Where mountains meet the sky, Greece does not begin with a battlefield. It begins with silence, with stone, with breath. It begins where time moves differently, slow and watchful, as if the earth itself knows what's coming, and chooses to hold still. The northern spine of Greece rises like an ancient backbone, ridges carved not by water alone, but by centuries of gods, empires, and men who dared defy both. Here, where the land narrows into a pass where the cliffs of Thermopylae lock arms with the sea, you'll find a place more sacred than any temple, a place that does not speak, but remembers. Mist drapes across the rocks like mourning cloth. Beneath your feet, the ground breathes. Steam rises from the hot springs as if the wounds of the world never healed. They call this place Thermopylae, the Hot Gates, a name that promises both passage and punishment. To the east lies the Malian Gulf, where the sea curls gently along the coast, as though unaware it once bore the hulls of 1,000 warships. To the west, the narrow path winds through rugged mountains, flanked by walls of rock that leave no room for retreat. This was not built for armies. This was carved for endurance. And before the banners, before the bronze, before the bodies, there was this, a lonely stretch of land kissed by fire and sea, where wind hums through pine trees like an old song, and each stone waits patient to become a story. Long before Leonidas, before Sparta's name would be etched into eternity, this land bore witness to other travelers, shepherds passing through, traders seeking salt, pilgrims chasing prophecy, and those who came simply to listen, to feel the hum of power beneath the soil. They say the gods once walked here, that Apollo's laughter echoed off the cliffs, that Artemis strung her bow in the forests above, that Ares, blood-drenched and beautiful, claimed the pass as his altar. And if you listen closely, perhaps you can still hear them, in the shifting wind, in the bubbling springs, in the silence between heartbeats. But now the gods have withdrawn, and the age of men approaches. Far to the south, in the land of Sparta, boys run barefoot over sharp stones. Their backs are straight, their eyes fixed ahead. They are taught not to cry, not to fear, not to hope, only to obey, only to endure. The agoge, they call it. A training of the body, yes, but more so, a sculpting of the soul. These boys will become something else, something harder, something the world will one day fear and envy. And in the shadowed corridors of palaces far to the east in Susa, in Persepolis, another story begins to stir. The Persian Empire, vast, gilded, unyielding, an empire of satraps and sculpted gardens, of law and ritual, of armies so large they drink rivers dry. A new king has taken the throne, Xerxes, son of Darius, not merely ruler, but god among men. He looks west and sees defiance. He sees Athens. He sees Greece. And he remembers Marathon. The storm is coming. But here, at Thermopylae, it hasn't arrived yet. The air is still. The olive trees sway gently, unaware. Fishermen cast nets in shallow bays. Children chase goats through the hills. And the land, quiet and eternal, waits. Thermopylae is more than geography. It is theater. The kind where every role has already been cast and every actor, though mortal, speaks with the weight of legend. The cliffs offer no mercy. There is no wide plain here, no maneuvering for advantage. Only a corridor, just wide enough for death to move forward, one man at a time. That is why Leonidas will choose this place. That is why it will echo forever. Even the stars seem to lean closer above Thermopylae, as though the heavens themselves are curious, as though they too wonder what will happen when 300 warriors choose to make their final bed at the edge of empire. And yet, no one arrives just yet. No armor gleams in the sunlight, no trumpet calls across the hills, only time and wind. You can almost feel the breath of history here, in the spaces between rocks, in the hush before footsteps, in the slow inhale before a shout. This is the place where legend will be born. But first, it must sleep. First, it must dream, because before the roar comes the silence, before the clash comes the calm. And before the last stand comes the first step. Leonidas does not yet stand at the pass. The 300 have not yet left their homes. The Persians have not yet darkened the horizon. But the land already knows. It always knows. Some places do not need prophecy. They are prophecy. So sleep now on the stones of Thermopylae. Let the steam of the earth warm your breath. Let the whispers of the pines fold around you. The sky is wide, the cliffs are tall, and in the stillness, where mountains meet the sky, history waits to be written. Before the roar of Thermopylae, before shields locked in narrow passes, before courage was carved into stone, there was something greater than fear. An empire. And its shadow stretched from horizon to horizon. Not a kingdom, not a city, but a world entire. The Persian Empire, forged by will, sustained by silence. Its borders touched deserts, jungles, mountains, and seas. It was not a place, it was gravity, pulling all things toward it. The sun rose in the east and kissed Persian banners by noon, and by dusk it bathed the western provinces in golden fire. The empire did not chase time, it commanded it. Darius the Great had once ruled this titan, a king who moved across the world like a sculptor across marble. He carved roads where none had existed. He stitched together lands with messengers of light and fire. The royal road, a ribbon of command across 2,000 miles, was more than stone and dust. It was an artery. Through it pulsed soldiers, scribes, spies, and dreams. At night, beacon towers glowed in sequence. Messages leapt from one horizon to the next. A rebellion could be crushed before the smoke rose. A province could feel the king's will without ever seeing his face. This was not just governance. It was vision. Darius had turned dozens of warring lands into a single breathing creature, not by replacing their cultures, but by absorbing them. The empire was a constellation of satrapies, provinces ruled by governors, each one a star orbiting a central flame. Egypt with its temples, Babylon with its gardens, Lydia with its coin. They kept their customs, their gods, their speech, but their loyalty was one, to the throne of thrones. But even Darius, with all his brilliance, was wounded by Marathon, a place he never saw, a name he could not forget. 10 years earlier, a small force of Greek hoplites had faced his expeditionary army and won. It wasn't just a military defeat. It was an insult, a blemish, an echo he could not silence. Darius died with that shame still alive, and in his place rose Xerxes. Xerxes, the son of Darius, son of empire, son of ambition. He walked barefoot through the gardens of Persepolis, where sculpted lions guarded every entrance and columns stretched high into blue silence. He wore rings older than the city of Athens. He was wrapped in silk but armored in vengeance. He did not rise to rule. He rose to restore, to avenge Marathon, to complete what his father could not. But vengeance, in the Persian way, was not a whisper. It was a storm, and Xerxes would not bring war. He would bring the world. He summoned engineers to span the Hellespont with floating bridges. Ships were lashed together with rope and wood, thousands of Theban army not marching on water, but over it. He ordered canals carved through the land so his fleet could avoid danger. Mountains would be moved, rivers would be disciplined. He summoned satraps from the corners of his empire. Each governor brought gifts, gold, grain, horses, iron soldiers, and all bowed low as they placed them at Xerxes' feet. It wasn't tribute, it was obedience made visible. India sent warriors with bows taller than men. From the Black Sea came axemen with curved blades. From Egypt, chariots gleamed under sun. The army that assembled was not just Persian. It was planetary, a sea of accents, a tide of skin tones, a choir of war, and it would march west. But this wasn't merely military. It was myth-making. Xerxes had inherited more than a throne. He had inherited an idea that all peoples under one ruler could exist without chaos, that difference could bend before order, that a single gaze from a divine king could keep peace across the earth. This was the Persian dream, not just to rule, but to bring the world beneath one banner and call it harmony. But there was one place that resisted the melody. A land too rocky for conquest, too proud for obedience, too small to matter and too loud to ignore. Greece, a mosaic of city-states, a web of rivalries. Sparta and Athens, Corinth and Thebes. each with its own laws, gods, and tempers. But when provoked, they could do the unthinkable. They could unite, and 10 years ago they had. They had drawn blood. Xerxes would answer. He did not send emissaries with olive branches. He sent them with ultimatums. Earth and water, they said, symbols of surrender. Some cities bowed. Some hesitated. And in Sparta, they were thrown into a pit. There would be no more messages, only fire. From the palaces of Susa to the outposts of Bactria, the empire stirred. The world felt it, a wind carrying dust, gold, and the smell of iron. Persian warships lined the harbors like teeth. The sea became a mirror to ambition, each wave a whisper of what was coming. And from the high places, where priests burned incense and read omen-all signs pointed west, inscriptions were carved, scrolls prepared, the names of cities to be conquered, already etched in clay. It was not arrogance, it was certainty. Xerxes was not marching to war. He was marching to memory, to correct the story. And Greece would either kneel or burn. But even as the great machine rumbled to life, as tens of thousands gathered, as hooves struck dust into clouds, as drums called ships into formation, there was one thing no map could measure: will. The will of men who would not yield. The will of cities built not on power, but on pride. The will of warriors who saw death, not as defeat, but as the price of meaning. Xerxes would march. The empire would cast its shadow, but in that shadow, a few would choose to stand. And Thermopylae, silent, narrow, waiting, would become the place where that choice echoed loudest. Long before the hot gates, before Leonidas and the clash of kings, there was a different plain, flat, silent, open to the sea, a stage not carved by cliffs, but by sand, sun, and the slow approach of fate. Marathon. Not yet legend, not yet poetry. Just a stretch of coastal earth in eastern Attica. But it was here, 10 years before Thermopylae, that the first blow was struck. And it never stopped echoing. The Persian Empire had come once before, under Darius, the father of Xerxes, a king who ruled from the shadows of Persepolis, whose words turned cities to dust, whose armies moved like floods. He had stretched his hand westward, toward the land of unruly voices, toward Athens. And in 490 BCE his fleet landed at Marathon. Not with hesitation, but with certainty. Their message was simple: kneel, and yet the Athenians did not. They sent for help, to Sparta, to any who would answer. But Sparta delayed, held by a religious festival, as if the gods had scheduled their silence. So the Athenians stood alone, 10,000 men, citizens, farmers, bakers, fathers, not soldiers by birth, but warriors by necessity. They marched east to the plain, to meet an empire face to face, led by a general named Miltiades, a man who understood that tactics can carve immortality from fear. And so they waited, spears in hand, armor gleaming like hope in the sun. Across the field the Persians gathered, perhaps twice as many, trained, hardened, a sea of wicker shields and curved blades. They expected victory. They always had it. And then the Greeks charged. No waiting, no retreat, no negotiation. They ran the length of the plain, in heavy bronze under arrow-filled skies, and slammed into the Persians with the fury of free men. Their center bent, their flanks enveloped. They crushed the wings of the Persian line and collapsed it inward. It was not luck. It was geometry, discipline, and the refusal to die nameless. When the dust cleared, Persians lay thick upon the sand. The Greeks had lost only a fraction, a stunning, incomprehensible victory. The survivors, what was left of Darius's army, fled back to their ships, and Athens stood unbroken. But the story didn't end there. It couldn't, because victory births expectation, and humiliation births vengeance. Darius returned to Persia with more than losses. He returned with a scar, a crack in his authority, and in a kingdom built on fear and obedience, cracks were dangerous. He vowed to return, to make an example of Athens, to remind the world that Persia never forgets. But the gods gave him no time. He died before the ships could launch again. and his son Xerxes inherited both the crown and the wound. Xerxes did not remember Marathon as history. He remembered it as insult, and to him it was not over. It had barely begun. For the Greeks, Marathon became more than a battle. It became identity, a symbol, proof that destiny favored the brave, that numbers could be defied, that even the greatest power the world had ever known could be stopped not by strength, but by will. The Athenians told the story again and again. They carved it into stone. They taught it to children. They buried their dead in ceremonial mounds on the battlefield, so their souls would rest where they had defied an empire. One man, a runner, was said to have sprinted from Marathon to Athens without stopping, to announce the victory before collapsing in death. Whether myth or truth, his breath became the breath of the city. It became a whisper passed through generations. We did it once, we can do it again. But Marathon wasn't just pride, it was prophecy. Because that unfinished story, the one Xerxes inherited, it begged for closure. And empires always finish their stories. Xerxes didn't want a skirmish. He wanted spectacle. Marathon had exposed a weakness, one he would not allow again. So he gathered not 10,000, but hundreds of thousands, an army so vast it was said to drink rivers dry, to create its own weather, to cast shadows on the sun. This was not a campaign, it was judgment. Every ship, every soldier was a word in a sentence that began at Marathon, and would end, Xerxes hoped, with Athens burning. But the Greeks saw it too. They saw what was coming, and they remembered. Marathon haunted them, not as fear but as responsibility, because now they knew what was possible. They had tasted it, and they could not go back to silence, to surrender. So they began to prepare. Themistocles, one of Athens' sharpest minds, argued not for land armies, but for ships, dozens, hundreds, wooden walls to stop Persian waves. Themistocles saw something others didn't, that the next war would not only be fought on land, but on sea, and whoever ruled the water would write the ending. But that was still to come. First, Xerxes had to reach them. First, he had to pass through the gate. And so, the road from Marathon led, inevitably, to Thermopylae, a pass so narrow, so brutal, that it could turn numbers into a disadvantage. That was where the Greeks would make their stand. Not because it was easy, but because it was poetic. A narrow corridor for a narrow hope. Leonidas, the Spartan king, knew the odds. But odds were just numbers. He had something else: discipline, honor, and memory. The memory of Marathon burned in the minds of every soldier. It whispered in the training yards of Sparta. It echoed in the marble halls of Athens. It rode with every message, sank into every prayer. Marathon had shown that Persia could bleed. Now Thermopylae would show the world how far Greece was willing to go to prove it again. And so, Marathon became more than a battle. It became a seed planted in blood, watered with pride, fed by fear, a seed that would bloom in the mountain pass, where 300 Spartans and their allies would stand, not to win, but to remind. To remind Persia that Greece would not kneel, to remind themselves that freedom has a price, and to remind the world that sometimes defiance is the only victory that matters. There was no single Greece. No empire, no king, no capital, just a patchwork of flame-tipped cities, bright, isolated, fiercely alive, and always ready to fight each other. From the peaks of the Pindus to the waves of the Aegean, the Greek world was a mosaic, each tile proud, each polis its own universe. Athens, sharp as a blade, brilliant as the sun on marble. Sparta, silent, simmering, made of iron and fear. Thebes, Corinth, Delphi, each with its secrets, its shrines, its ambitions. The world of the polis was not one of harmony, it was one of tension, a constant humming standoff between independence and identity. Greece was not a nation, it was an argument. In the agora of Athens, men argued like poets and fought like philosophers. Olive trees whispered over scrolls, statues stood witness as orators carved truth from the air. This was a city made of light and defiance, birthplace of democracy, experiment in human will. But behind the beauty, restlessness. Its ships ruled the seas, its words ruled the stage, but Athens was never at rest. It provoked, it questioned, it dared. And then there was Sparta. If Athens was fire, Sparta was stone, forged in silence, raised in fear, devoted not to debate but to endurance. Every child-born Spartan was weighed on a scale of worth. Every man a weapon, every woman a shield behind the shield. Their lives were sacrifices made daily to the altar of discipline. Helots worked the fields while Spartans trained for death. Kings ruled, but the laws ruled them. They spoke little. They feared little. They compromised never. But they were not alone. Corinth, rich and cunning, lived on trade winds and silver coins. Its temples shimmered, its merchants whispered, a city that bartered influence like olives. Delphi, perched on the slope of Mount Parnassus, where gods still murmured through the mouth of the oracle. Here prophecy guided kings, and riddles shaped destiny. Delos, Rhodes, Argos, Mycenae, the names echoed like footsteps on marble, ancient, sacred, proud. The Greek world was a constellation, each polis its own star, bound together by language and myth, kept apart by pride and memory. Their loyalties were local, their alliances temporary. They shared gods, but not rulers, shared enemies, but not unity. Even when Persia loomed like a storm on the horizon, the Greek world did not rally, it argued. Should they resist? Should they submit? Should they negotiate? Should they flee? Voices clashed. Tempers rose. Old feuds flared. Sparta had strength, but not the navy. Athens had ships, but not the unity. Corinth held wealth, but not the will. No one polis could speak for all. It would take something greater, something ancient and terrifying to bind them. Fear. Fear of Persia, of the world's largest army, of an empire that measured its power not in miles but in silence. When Persia conquered, the noise stopped. Cities stopped, rebellion stopped, breathing stopped, and now that silence was approaching. But in the spaces between that fear, there lived something else. A strange, stubborn thing, older than the temples, deeper than politics. The love of freedom. Not the freedom of lawless lands, but the freedom to shape your city, your customs, your soul. To pray in your own dialect, to fight for your own God, to vote, to speak, to fight, to fail, in your own name. That was the paradox of the polis. They would fight each other for centuries, but die for the idea that no man, not even a god-king, could rule them all. In Sparta, 2 kings prepared, bound by law, not ambition. In Athens, debates gave way to action. Ships were carved from forests, spears from silver mines, poets became soldiers, philosophers drafted plans. Messages crossed mountain and sea, some answered, some didn't. Not everyone would fight, not every polis would stand, but enough would. For in the fractured world of Greece, even unity could be born from resistance. They chose their ground. A narrow pass, a gate between mountains and sea. Thermopylae, the hot gates. Where the cliffs boil with mist and the springs whisper like wounds, a place old as myth, sacred to Heracles, marked by war long before Xerxes ever dreamed of conquest. Here the Greeks would make their stand. The world of the polis, divided, defiant, glorious, had never known a king of kings. Now it would face one. And perhaps in facing him, it would remember not just what it was, but what it could be. Beneath every marble statue there was a fracture. In every oath, a loophole. But in every Greek heart, Athens or Sparta, Corinth or Delphi, there was one shared memory, that no empire, no matter how vast, had the right to silence them. And so, city by city, stone by stone, the Greek world turned. From debate to decision, from separation to standstill, from politics to war, and on a narrow road between sea and mountain, the fractured house of Greece would stand shoulder to shoulder, for 3 days, against the full weight of empire, and make history echo. In the heart of Persia, where the sun gilds palaces in firelight and every breeze tastes of sandalwood and smoke, the world stirs. The court is a garden of precision and power. Curtains shimmer like water. Voices rise, then vanish like incense. Behind golden doors and beneath silver domes, decisions are made that will stretch across continents, a world shaped not by the hands of the people, but by the will of a single man. Here sits Xerxes, not merely a king, not merely a son, but a god in waiting. He walks through the halls of Persepolis with sandals untouched by dust, guarded by silence, shadowed by servants. They speak his name softly, not out of fear, though there is plenty of that, but out of awe, reverence. He is the son of Darius the Great, heir to the greatest empire the world has ever seen. And yet, he also inherits his father's humiliation, a wound carved 10 years prior on the plains of Marathon, where Greek defiance became Persian disgrace. Darius had sworn vengeance, but death came first. And now, vengeance passes to Xerxes, not just to restore honor, but to prove that no mortal shall defy a god. While Persia burns with divine ambition, across the Aegean, a different kind of preparation begins. Sparta, a city not built on dreams of empire, but on discipline, on silence, on blood. Where boys are taken from mothers at 7, where love and war are braided like rope, where kings are not born but tested. Sparta is ruled by 2 kings, an ancient system built on balance, forged in mistrust. 2 swords always drawn in opposite directions, but in this moment only one blade will be raised. Leonidas. Not first in line, not the obvious heir, but sometimes it is the quiet fire that endures the longest. The boy who stood longer, fought harder, spoke less. He did not reach for the throne. It reached for him. Some say the gods chose him. Some say the Ephors did. But somewhere between those myths stands a man of sinew and silence. A man raised not for comfort, but for sacrifice. Xerxes prepares in robes soaked with perfume and prophecy. Leonidas prepares in armor worn down by generations. The Persian king builds bridges of boats and chains, stretching across the sea. Leonidas builds silence among his men, stretching across their souls. Both know war is coming, but only one believes he cannot lose. In Persia, to disobey the king is to deny the divine. In Greece, to obey the king too much is to forget liberty. And so, when word reaches the Hellenic world that Xerxes is gathering men from across Asia, that elephants walk alongside horsemen, and that the sea itself carries the tools of invasion, there is no unity, no congress, no call to arms. There is only the question, who will fight? Most cities stall. Many kneel. Only Sparta sharpens its blades. But even Sparta, for all its valor, hesitates. It is the festival of Carneia, sacred days when no war may be waged. The gods must be honored before the enemy can be faced. Leonidas, bound by religion, yet aware of urgency, makes a decision. He will not send the full Spartan army. He will not violate the law. But he will go. 300 Spartans, his royal guard. Men with sons to carry their names. So that none go to battle with nothing to lose. It is not a war party. It is a warning. Back in Persia, Xerxes builds a throne to be carried into Greece. Not to watch the battle, but the surrender. He imagines cities falling like dominoes. He imagines Greeks kneeling not out of fear, but in recognition that the divine cannot be denied. Leonidas dreams differently. He dreams of delaying fate, of showing the world that resistance has a face, even if that face must die. They are 2 men who will never meet until the final hour. But in every sense that matters, their war has already begun. One was born in silks, the other in scars. One commands from behind, the other leads from the front. One will offer submission gilded in mercy. The other will offer death, wrapped in purpose. And the gods, they watch. From Olympus to the Zagros Mountains, from Delphi's chasm to Babylon's hanging gardens. Because this is not merely a war of men. It is the theater of the eternal. In the Persian court, astrologers trace the stars. They say omens are favorable, that Greece will fall. In Sparta, seers read the entrails of goats. They say death will come, but not before glory. And so the pieces move. Ships kiss the sea with warlike rhythm. Boots thunder across the royal road. Scribes pen royal decrees while poets whisper of heroism yet to be written. Leonidas kneels in prayer, not for victory, but for strength, to hold the line, to prove that the gods are not the only ones who can shape destiny. And somewhere deep in his palace Xerxes smiles, because he does not believe he is marching to war. He believes he is marching to history. But history, like gods, does not serve. It remembers, not always the strongest, not always the victorious, but always the defiant. Thus begins the march, a king from the east with an empire behind him, a king from the west with death ahead. Between them only a narrow pass, and a storm that has yet to break. They say the gods walk in silence. But when Xerxes moved, the world heard him coming. From the deep corridors of the palace at Susa, where jeweled walls flickered with torchlight and the breath of power lingered in every polished stone, came the signal. A rustle of robes, a stroke of ink, a single decree, and a continent stirred. This was no army. This was a tide. It began in whispers. Messengers riding like lightning across the royal road, bearing orders on clay tablets, commands pressed in cuneiform. And then the whispers became dust. Dust kicked up by hooves, by sandals, by wheels. A procession not of hundreds, not of thousands, but of hundreds of thousands, maybe more. No empire had ever moved like this. Not so far, not so many, not so bold. Xerxes, son of Darius, god-king of Persia, did not just prepare for war. He prepared to swallow the world. From the heart of the empire, Susa, then Ecbatana, then Persepolis they came. Armies drawn from every province, every satrapy, every land where the king's word ruled. A mosaic of men. Medes in flowing robes, Scythians on horseback, Ethiopians in leopard skins, Assyrians with bronze-tipped arrows, Phoenicians steering ships down river and coast. Each language different, each god their own. But all bowed to one name, Xerxes. He moved not like a general, but like a storm system. Slow, implacable, impossible to ignore. The empire prepared its offering to war. Oxen slaughtered, barrels sealed, roads widened, bridges reinforced. Even the sea was asked to kneel. At the narrow strait of the Hellespont, where Asia meets Europe like fingers touching across the blue, the engineers arrived. They built bridges of ships side by side, lashed together with chains and planks. 2 ribbons across the water, one for the army, one for the dream. And when a storm broke the first attempt, scattering ships like toy boats, the sea was flogged, literally, lashed with whips, cursed by name, punished for its disobedience. Because no one defied the King of Kings, not even nature. When the bridges held, the army crossed, day after day. Endless lines of infantry, cavalry, carts, pack animals, sacred fire altars, siege weapons. Tens of thousands, then tens of thousands more. The march bent the horizon. Along the coastline of Thrace, past forests and rivers and hills, the sound never stopped, the creak of carts, the clang of armor and the growl of beasts, and beneath it all the beat of sandals on earth. The land remembered every step. They called it the Great March, but it was more than that. It was the world's longest shadow. Even time seemed to stretch around it. Villages were emptied of grain, fields stripped bare, forests cut for firewood. Wells ran dry before the rearguard passed through. Every day, the army needed thousands of animals, thousands of liters of water, thousands of lives devoted just to feeding the machine. It was not elegant. It was not romantic. It was monstrous, and yet it moved. Behind the soldiers came the royal court, slower, grander, the canopy of gold, the servants, the concubines, the magi chanting prayers, the scribes writing everything, always, forever. And at the center, riding higher than the rest, surrounded by immortals with golden spears and faces masked in silver, was Xerxes. He did not shout. He did not rage. He did not need to. He was the will of empire made flesh. He passed through cities like a second sun. All eyes turned toward him, some in awe, some in fear, some in calculation, but no one looked away. Even the rivers parted. At the Strymon they built pontoons. At the Nestos they diverted flow. At the Axios they marched through the mud and came out gleaming. When nature resisted, they reshaped it. When geography rebelled, they conquered it. Xerxes walked across the world as if it had been paved for him. And yet, not all was smooth. In Macedonia, murmurs rose. In Thessaly, alliances flickered. Some Greek cities bowed low, offering earth and water. Others only offered silence. It didn't matter, not yet, because the army kept marching. Through Thrace and Macedon, down the spine of the land, until the hills grew steeper, the paths narrower, and the news stranger. For across the land, another movement stirred, not as loud, not as large, but perhaps just as powerful. A meeting of Greek cities, a congress of the unwilling, a fragile flame lit in the dark, resisting. They had heard of Xerxes' march. They had seen the sky darken. But some refused to kneel, and so the great march met its echo, one in size, the other in will. Still, Xerxes did not pause. He could not, for behind him the empire stretched vast and hungry. Before him, Greece glittered like a jewel waiting to be claimed. He sent scouts. He sent envoys. Some came back. Some did not. No matter. The army crested the ridges near Thessaly. And for the first time the cliffs of Thermopylae appeared, ghost-like in the haze. A narrow pass, a place between mountain and sea, a gate. And someone was waiting at the gate. But Xerxes did not stop. He simply looked ahead, the sea to his right, the mountains to his left. And somewhere in the distance, a name whispered on the wind. Leonidas. Still, the king rode on. Because this was not a question. It was a sentence. The empire had decided. The march had begun. And now it would end. The winds of the Aegean stirred uneasily. Not a breeze of salt and sail, but something older, something deeper. The kind of wind that carries messages the birds won't speak aloud. Across the cities of Greece, fires burned low and voices burned high. The shadow of Xerxes stretched across the land long before his army touched its soil. At the sacred site of Delphi, where gods whispered behind stone lips, smoke curled from the oracle's chamber. Pilgrims came with heavy feet and heavier questions. "What should we do?" they asked the Pythia. "What will happen to Greece?" The answers were riddles soaked in fear. She spoke of wooden walls and fire, of a city's ruin and a country's soul, words no one fully understood, yet all took to heart. And while the oracle spoke in tongues, the cities of Greece did something remarkable. They talked. At the Isthmus of Corinth, where land narrows to a throat between the Peloponnese and the rest of the mainland, the council convened, an impossible gathering in any other age. City-states that once squabbled over olives and honor now sent envoys with the kind of urgency that only survival teaches. Sparta, Athens, Corinth, Thebes, Achaea, Arcadia, all with different tongues, different gods, different dreams. But they shared a nightmare. And nightmares have a way of sharpening minds. In the stone chambers of the Isthmian Council, debate spilled like wine. The walls echoed with voices, measured, angry, urgent. Who would lead? Who would follow? Who would stay silent? Some wanted to flee north, others wanted to fortify the Peloponnese and abandon the rest. There were maps on tables and lines drawn across them in chalk and desperation. Athens sent Themistocles, clever, calculating, dangerous when cornered, a man who saw further than others, perhaps because he never looked with just his eyes. He had heard the oracle's warning about wooden walls and interpreted it his own way, not as the wooden walls of the Acropolis, but as the wooden hulls of triremes, warships, fast, narrow, sharp as a blade's edge. He rose before the others and spoke not of cities, but of seas. The Persians, he said, will not walk across the water. They will sail, and so must we. His words were strange, but they carried weight. Athens had a navy, few others did, but that would change. If Greece was to survive, it would have to float. Still, not all agreed. Corinth eyed Athens with suspicion. Thebes hesitated. The smaller cities fretted. It was hard to think of unity when unity had never been practiced. Greece was not an empire. It was an argument. A 1,000-year-long debate in marble and blood. And so they turned, again, to Sparta. Sparta, who spoke less and listened more. Sparta, who did not care for diplomacy but knew the sound of war drums better than any. Their delegate, stern-faced and sharp-eyed, said little at first. He listened to Themistocles, watched the room, gauged the temperature not of the wine but of the will. Then he gave an answer that was not permission, but prophecy. Sparta will fight, he said. Not with many, but with the right ones. And with that, something ancient moved. Greece did not unite, not truly, but it began to lean ever so slightly in the same direction. They chose a line to hold, Thermopylae, a narrow pass, a gate between mountains and sea. A place where numbers mattered less than nerve. It was not a wall, but it might as well have been. If it could hold, time would stretch. And time, Themistocles knew, was everything. Every day bought at Thermopylae was another ship built, another plan forged, another prayer offered. While the council bickered over how many to send and who would command, another storm was brewing quietly. Not on paper, not in courts, but in the heart of a man, Leonidas, the Spartan king. He heard the same arguments, weighed the same doubts, but he measured things differently, not in numbers, in legacies. He knew the pass was death, knew the council would hesitate, knew Sparta's laws forbade full-scale war without the blessings of the ephors, and the timing of the sacred festival of Carneia made quick mobilization impossible. But he also knew something else. There are moments when law must bow to purpose, when ceremony yields to necessity, and when a king does not ask permission, he acts. So Leonidas gathered his guard, the Hippeis, 300 men chosen not for strength alone, but for soul, men with sons to carry their names, men who understood that glory is not the absence of fear, but the mastery of it. He did not promise them victory. He promised them remembrance, and they followed. Others joined. Thespians, Thebans, Phocians, not many. Not enough to stop an empire, but enough to say, we will not go quietly. Back at the council, word spread. The Spartans were marching north. The games would wait. The laws would bend. The gods would watch. And so, a new energy took hold. Some still argued. That never stopped. But now those arguments carried urgency, not avoidance. And one by one, cities offered what they could. A ship, a spear, a man. Greece was not unified, but it was awakening. Themistocles returned to Athens with a plan. The council would buy him time. At sea, he would prepare the blow to come. Themistocles was no sailor by birth, but he understood tides, and not just the ones made by the moon. He knew this. Persia would win, unless it drowned first. And Thermopylae was the first dam in the flood. Back in Delphi, the oracle whispered her riddles still. But her voice no longer echoed through empty halls. Her words were being answered, not with certainty, but with courage. The council disbanded, not with resolution, but with resolve. The pieces were in motion. Across hills and harbors, across valleys and vineyards, men kissed their families goodbye, gripped spears with calloused hands, and stepped into the long shadow of fate. No one knew how long Thermopylae could hold, only that it had to. The resistance had begun, not with fanfare, not with trumpet, but with a gathering of minds in a room lit by firelight, with doubts in every corner but one truth in the center. Greece would answer, and its answer would echo louder than the Persian roar. The road to Thermopylae did not begin at a single gate, nor rise from a single heartbeat. It started in the stillness of Spartan dawns, where fathers trained sons not to live, but to die well. It began in the echo of a decision made in a council room thick with tension and prophecy. It whispered through fields where mothers stood still as statues, holding back tears for the sake of tradition. It rumbled like the hooves of horses over dry earth, from Corinth, from Thespi, from Thebes, cities whose names would be carved into legend not for their power but for their choice. This was not a march of millions. This was not the thunder of empire. This was a quieter kind of sound. Boots over gravel, armor clinking like wind chimes, the murmur of prayer between clenched teeth, and silence, always silence. 300 Spartans, not the youngest, not the swiftest, but chosen. Handpicked by Leonidas himself, not because they were without fear, but because they knew it and went anyway. They were fathers, all of them. Every man had a son. Because this was not just about strength. It was about what would be remembered. The farewell was without speeches, no promises of return. No romantic gestures, just a long look, a shared nod, and the knowledge that this was the last time they'd see home under the daylight. The wives stood on one side, their eyes dry by force of habit. The children clung to their father's arms, confused by the silence. There are no lullabies for goodbye in Sparta. Only legacy. Only the echo of a name whispered into history before it's even been earned. The path from Sparta to Thermopylae was more than miles. It was marked by stories and spirits. Through olive groves that had seen the passing of gods, past ruined shrines and fresh altars piled with offerings, figs, bread, a lock of hair, a dagger passed down from a grandfather who had fought in another war for another reason. They did not travel alone. The Spartans were joined by allies, some eager, others uncertain. From Thespiae came 700, fierce, free, and stubborn. From Thebes, a reluctant offering, 400 who marched with more questions than loyalty. From other corners of Greece came small bands, Opuntian Locrians, Malian volunteers, Phocians armed with conviction more than arms. No one expected them to win, but that wasn't the point. They would hold the pass, not for glory, but to prove that a stand could be made. Thermopylae, the hot gates, a place where the mountains press the land into a corridor, where cliffs rise like teeth and the sea claws at the rocks below. The air smelled of sulfur and salt. The hot springs bubbled like old wounds refusing to close. Steam curled through the trees, carrying with it the scent of something ancient. It was sacred. It had always been sacred, even before it became a battlefield. The Spartans reached it first, and when they looked upon it, they did not see terrain. They saw purpose. Here, the mass of Persia would mean nothing. Here, narrowness would be their weapon. One shield beside another, one spear point facing forward, one heartbeat multiplied by courage. Before camp was built, they walked the land. Leonidas moved quietly, his eyes scanning the cliffs. He spoke little, but when he did, it was to ask about the trails, the paths only locals knew. The Phocians pointed to a goat trail high above, winding through the mountains. Leonidas nodded but said nothing. Even then he felt the shape of the future forming in stone. At night, they did not sing. There was no joy in what was to come. But there was ritual. Training continued in the dark, shields raised, formations tested. Spears glinted in moonlight like fangs. Some prayed. Some sharpened blades in silence. Others stared into the fire as if they could already see the ghosts rising from the flames. And perhaps they could. Themistocles, back in Athens, was building ships. But here, at Thermopylae, it was not about sails or storms. It was about standing still, holding a line. A message had been sent to the great king, words that defied the very structure of empire. We will not kneel. Not because they believed they could stop the invasion, but because they believed something greater than armies was at stake. Leonidas walked among his men each evening. He did not wear a crown. He wore the same armor, the same red cloak. He carried the same weight. He did not inspire with speeches. He inspired with presence, a king not above his warriors but beside them. He remembered each name, each face, each reason they had come. He carried those with him quietly like a burden sewn into the seams of his cloak. There were scouts who brought word from afar. The Persians were coming, a force unlike anything Greece had seen. Hundreds of thousands, an empire that drank rivers and flattened forests just to feed its hunger. And it was moving, closer, hour by hour. But still the Greeks waited, not because they had no fear, but because they had made peace with it. And in the night, the hot springs hissed. The earth whispered stories older than any man. The stars wheeled overhead, indifferent and bright. And the men dreamed, not of home, but of standing. Because the moment would come. The moment when they would be outnumbered, surrounded, and remembered. And when it came, they would not flinch. Children back home asked where their fathers had gone. Wives stared at empty doorways. The city gates stood still, holding silence like breath. But in Thermopylae there was no confusion. Only preparation. Only quiet ritual. Armor was polished not for beauty but for readiness. Helmets adorned not with gold but with purpose. Cloaks brushed not for ceremony but because they would soon be soaked in blood. And Leonidas? He knelt one morning at the edge of the pass, touched the ground, closed his eyes. This was where they would fall. And this narrow gate between mountain and sea, would be the altar, not to a god, but to an idea, that freedom was worth defending, that resistance had meaning, even in death, especially in death. They were ready. Thermopylae, the hot gates, a place where steam rises from the earth like breath from the nose of a waking god. It is here, at this narrow pass between mountain and sea, that time slows down. History doesn't gallop, it waits for something worth remembering. The Persians are coming. But before they arrive, before a single arrow is loosed, a wall is built. Not a grand wall. Not the kind that keeps out whole armies or lasts 1,000 years. This wall is rough. Stones piled hurriedly by calloused hands. No grandeur, no illusions, just purpose. It stands in a place barely wide enough for a cart. On one side, the mountain looms like a silent judge. On the other, the sea sighs and groans as if aware of what's to come. And here, on this strip of dirt and destiny, Leonidas walks the line, not like a king, but like a shepherd before a storm. The Spartans are already in formation, shields resting by their sides, feet planted in the soil like roots preparing for fire. He moves among them, not with orders, but with nods, with silence. Because in Sparta words are weapons, and every man here already knows his duty. They did not come to return. They came to remain. They are not alone. To their flank stand men from Thespiae, Thebes, and Phocis, farmers, craftsmen, poets, priests, not born for war, but pulled into it by proximity, loyalty, or prophecy. They build the wall together. The sound of stone scraping stone becomes a heartbeat, steady and defiant. Some men joke as they work, trading barbs to cover fear. Others remain quiet, their eyes drifting toward the pass, imagining the thunder that will soon roll through it. At night, the hot springs whisper beside them. Steam curls in the air like incense, and the rocks sweat with ancient heat. Some say the gods walk these waters. Others say the steam is just nature's breath. But here, where myth and matter blend, it's hard to know the difference. Across the bay, another kind of wall is being built, not of stone, but of ships. Themistocles has gathered the fleet, Athenians mostly, but other city-states too, those who still dare to dream of freedom. Their triremes float in the Aegean like knives tucked under a sleeve. They cannot match the Persian navy in numbers, but in these narrow waters numbers can mean little. Like Leonidas, Themistocles bets on the shape of the land and the squeeze point, on the bottleneck. Two fronts, one hope. If the sea holds and the pass holds, Greece holds. If either falters, the fire spreads. Dawn, the wall is finished. Crude but firm. The Spartans now begin their drills. Shields lock. Spears rise and fall in smooth unison. Dust kicks up, catching the morning light in golden swirls. They train not because they need to, but because rhythm is comfort. Repetition is prayer. And this is a kind of worship. Further down the slope, a few boys, too young for battle, fetch water and tend fires, carry messages. They watch the warriors with wide eyes. To them, these 300 are giants. But the Spartans don't see themselves that way. They see only duty. And the wall. Leonidas stands beside Dienekes, one of his fiercest. They watch the horizon together. "You think he'll come tomorrow?" Dienekes asks. Leonidas doesn't answer. Instead, he squints into the rising heat. "He's already here," he says quietly. And he is. The first Persian scouts appear like shadows at the edge of the world. Dark figures on horseback. Too far to threaten, close enough to announce, the earth has begun to shake. By nightfall, the fires on the Persian side stretch like a necklace across the land. Tens of thousands of tiny orange mouths, each one promising chaos. The Spartans do not flinch. They eat. They oil their weapons. They laugh. They are not mad. They are prepared. Further up the mountain trail, a man named Ephialtes watches with unease. He is not a soldier, not trusted by Sparta, but he knows the land well. And in that knowledge lies danger. The sea continues to churn. Waves slap the hulls of the Greek ships. Themistocles walks the deck of his command trireme. He prays, not for victory, but for storms. On land, the Persians make camp. Xerxes, the king of kings, watches from his golden throne. He's been told the pass is held by a handful of Greeks. He finds it laughable, but he also finds it inconvenient. He wants to march through. He wants this formality dealt with quickly. He sends an envoy, a Persian noble on horseback, bearing a scroll and a choice. "Lay down your arms. You will be spared. You will be rewarded." The offer echoes through the pass. The Spartans listen. Leonidas steps forward. "Come and take them," he says. And with that, the wall is no longer just stone. It is a promise. The Persians do not attack that day. Or the next. Xerxes waits. He's not used to resistance. He expects fear to grow like mold. But instead, The Greeks dig in. The Spartans sharpen their blades with calm hands. The Thespians whisper songs from home. The Thebans pray, not all of them willingly. Every hour that passes, the tension swells, like the sea tide rising toward the cliffs. On the third day, the wind shifts. The scouts report movement. Tens of thousands of Persian troops begin to file toward the pass. Archers, infantry, cavalry. The mountain trembles beneath their feet. The earth groans. But the wall holds, and behind it, the Spartans stand still. Their formation is simple, phalanx. Shield locked to shield. Spears bristling like a porcupine daring a lion. The Persian commander rides to the front. He gives the signal. A wave of soldiers pours forward, and the wall bites back. The first clash is brutal. Persian arrows darken the sky, but the Spartans duck behind shields, barely flinching. Then, as the archers reload, they surge forward. A spear through the eye, a shield bashed to the throat, a formation tight as a drumbeat. Behind them, the wall watches, as if pleased, as if proud. The first wave breaks like water on rock. The second fares no better. By nightfall, Persian bodies fill the pass. The sea nearby begins to wash them clean. Leonidas wipes his blade and looks to the mountain. They'll try the goat path, he mutters. Dienicus nods. They know. They always knew. The wall may hold. But men break. That night, Ephialtes slips into the Persian camp. He tells them of a way around. Through the hills, through the dark, a path the Spartans cannot guard. Not forever, not with so few, but that's tomorrow's shadow. Tonight the wall still stands. The sea still stirs. And 300 men rest their heads on stones, dreaming not of survival, but of meaning. Because sometimes it's not about winning. It's about where you choose to make your stand. When the East met the West in iron and fire, the wind shifts. It carries more than just the scent of salt and soil. It carries the coming of war. At the narrow gate of Thermopylae, the morning light flickers across bronze. Each glint a reflection of fate. Each helmet a silent vow. They are ready. Leonidas walks the lines again. Not like a king above men, but like a father among sons. No words left to give. Only nods. Only eyes. Only silence. The Spartans brace behind their wall, not of stone, but of shields. Thespians beside them. Thebans too. All eyes turned east. And east comes forward. The dust rises first, a curtain of golden iron. Then the sound. Boots upon boots, spears rattling like dry thunder, drums that echo like heartbeats. And then they appear. The Persians. The immortals do not lead, not yet. These are the first wave. Medes, Scythians, Elamites. A mosaic of empire, sent to test the gate. They move like water, fast, flowing, confident. But this pass is not a river. It is a knife's edge. And on that edge waits Sparta. The first clash is sudden. Metal strikes metal. Shields grind. Spears splinter. But the line does not bend. The Spartans do not chase. They do not rush. They hold. Step forward. Thrust. Step back. A rhythm older than the empire itself. The pass is too narrow for numbers to matter. The Persian horde becomes a trickle. A handful at a time. And the handful always dies. The bodies pile. Not behind the Spartans, but before them. An offering to the mountain. The sun climbs higher. Heat licks the air. The hot springs hiss at the carnage, as if protesting this desecration of peace. Still the Persians come. Still the line holds. Arrows fly, but shields rise. The wall becomes a roof, a bronze sky above warriors carved from will. The dust turns to mud and mixed with blood, mixed with sweat, mixed with memory. This is not a battle. It is a demonstration. Xerxes watches from afar. Confused. Annoyed. This was supposed to be a warning strike, not a slaughter. He sends messengers to demand surrender. He offers land, titles, life. Leonidas replies with silence, then with words as sharp as spears. Come and take them. Back at sea, Themistocles holds his line. His fleet watches the horizon. Waves crash in counter-rhythm to the battle on land. Storms threaten. Ships creak, but no one breaks. Two fronts, one resistance. The second wave comes, this time more fierce, more prepared, but also more desperate. They charge with cries in many tongues, with flags from many lands, but with the same fate. The Spartan phalanx absorbs it all. Their shields groan, but never fall. Their discipline sings, a quiet hum beneath the chaos. Behind them, fallen friends are dragged from the path, not in retreat, but to make room for more courage. The pass narrows the odds, no one turns warriors into walls. Still, they do not chase the enemy, they hold, and hold, and hold. Time loses shape. An hour feels like a lifetime, a minute like a grave. When the sun lowers, the field is a graveyard. Persians retreat, staggered, bleeding. Xerxes frowns, his pride pierced. The immortals are summoned, his elite, his legends, his shadow army. Draped in black, faces hidden, they move like phantoms. The Spartans do not flinch. They know of these men. They have waited for them. The immortals charge, faster, smarter, deadlier. They strike with two weapons, dance with death, move like serpents. But they meet Spartans, and Spartans do not dance. They do not spin. They do not weave. They strike. Precise, practical, permanent. Immortals fall, one, by 10, by more. Their myth dissolves in the dust. The day ends not in Persian triumph, but in silence, the kind that even empires cannot command. Campfires flicker on both sides that night. In the Persian tent there is fury, confusion, a map stained with wine and fingerprints, plans reshuffled, orders rewritten. In the Greek camp, there is quiet pride, no boasting, no laughter, just the knowledge. They stood and did not fall. Leonidas walks again, not to inspect, but to remember. Each man, each name, each story. He knows this is only the beginning. But sometimes beginnings matter more than endings. He kneels at the edge of the pass, fingers touching bloodied soil, like a farmer planting something that may one day grow. Tomorrow the Persians will return, more determined, more brutal. But tonight, Thermopylae belongs to Greece. The sea whispers to the mountains. The mountains answer with stillness, and beneath the stars, the 300 sleep, not as heroes and not as martyrs, but as men who did what few dared to do. They held. They proved that numbers are not the measure of strength, that the body is not the only shield, that sometimes a narrow pass is the widest road to immortality. In the hush of the night, as oil lamps flicker, as swords are sharpened in shadows, as the air tastes of iron and fire, one truth remains. The first assault has ended, but the story has only just begun. They were more than men, or so the stories said, the immortals, 10,000 strong, 10,000 silent shadows. A whisper of death that echoed from the heart of Persia to the edge of the known world. They wore black and gold, gleaming in the sun like living statues, marching in perfect rhythm, faces unreadable behind their veils and helmets. They did not speak, they did not break rank. They advanced like gravity, calm, steady, inescapable. They had never known defeat, and Xerxes believed they never would. But even gravity can be challenged when it meets a wall carved from will. In the narrow pass of Thermopylae, where the mountains pressed like the hands of old gods, they came, wave after wave, expecting the same song they always heard, screams, flight, surrender. Instead they met silence, and then the crack of spear against shield. Leonidas had seen them before. Years ago, during his journey east, he knew the myth. He knew the fear they spread, but he also knew the weakness hiding behind perfection. "Let them come," he said quietly. And so they came. The first clash was like thunder bottled in a canyon. The immortals surged, not with fury, but with certainty. The Spartans held. Bronze met steel. Red cloaks flared like fire in the dusk. And for a moment, the unstoppable paused. Because the Spartans didn't fall. They pivoted. The immortals were trained for chaos. But this was not chaos. This was order. Brutal, ancient, deliberate order. Each Spartan held his place. Each movement choreographed from childhood. Each shield locked. Each spear placed like punctuation in a sentence that read, "Not here, not today." The Persian elite fought with curved blades and elegance, their strikes fast, their steps flowing. But speed means little when there is no gap to exploit. And beauty breaks when it meets the blunt edge of necessity. The narrow pass worked against them. They couldn't surround. They couldn't outmaneuver. They had to march straight into spears. And spears, when wielded by those with nothing to lose, become instruments of ruin. Xerxes watched from afar, not worried at first. The immortals were his jewel, his final word. No army had ever resisted them for long, but time passed, and the sun dipped lower, and still the line held. Whispers reached him. The Spartans fight like they are already dead, and that unsettled him. Back in the past, the battle raged like a storm trapped in a bottle. Leonidas moved through the line, not like a king, but like a brother. He fought beside his men, shielding, striking, bleeding. He was not above them. He was them, and they fought harder for it. One immortal, face painted like a death mask, lunged with a dagger. Leonidas turned, caught the wrist, drove his own blade upward. A gasp, a moment of silence. Even the shadows could bleed. It wasn't just Sparta that stood that day. Beside them were Thespians, unarmored but unyielding. Thebans, reluctant, confused, but still present. Allies who held the line not for glory, but because something deeper than survival was at stake. There are moments in history where men stop being names. They become symbols. And in Thermopylae, even the nameless stood eternal. The immortals regrouped, attacked again, changed formation, tried arrows, tried shock, tried fear. But fear cannot live where death is already welcomed. One Spartan took a blade to the leg. He limped. Staggered, another man stepped in without a word. No complaint, no break, just the line, reforming. Again and again. It was as if the mountain itself had grown teeth and decided to fight back. The immortals began to fall. Slowly at first, then faster. The illusions faded. 10,000 had become 9, then 8. Their veils soaked with sweat and blood. Their formations fraying. Their mystique gone. Xerxes ordered archers. Let the sky go black with arrows. Let death rain from above. And it did. But even the shadows in the sky could not break the shield wall. "Good," one Spartan said with a grin. "Then we will fight in the shade." The immortals tried one final push before nightfall. Desperation crept into their rhythm. A crack here, a scream there. One leapt high, blade flashing. A Spartan pulled him from the air mid-flight, drove him to the dirt, and did not let him rise. Another ran. A commander yelled. More followed. The myth unraveled like a threadbare cloak in the wind. By the end of the day, the pass was quiet. The hot springs bubbled beside the blood-soaked ground. Bodies piled where glory had tried and failed. Leonidas stood in the fading light, his spear tip cracked, his arm wrapped in cloth. And around him silence, not from defeat, from awe. Even the wind paused to remember. The immortals are bled. And with that blood, the world remembered something. That courage can humble giants. that training can break prophecy, that sometimes all it takes to defy a god is a man who refuses to kneel. Far across the sea, Athens heard the news. In Sparta, mothers did not weep. They lit candles. They whispered to the wind. They knew what their sons had done. Xerxes would not retreat. Not yet. But something had shifted. A seed of doubt planted deep. In the days that followed, more Persians would come. The pass would be betrayed. The wall would fall. Leonidas would die. But this day, this one day, it belonged to the few who stood against the world and made the world flinch. The immortals would fight again. They would kill again. Their name would continue to echo. But it would never sound the same. Because now, somewhere in that echo, was the sound of their own blood hitting the earth. And in that drop, history changed. Forever. There are many kinds of silence in war. There's the silence of strategy, as generals pore over maps lit by trembling candlelight. There's the silence of waiting, the slow ticking of fate before the charge. And then, there's the silence of betrayal. It doesn't scream. It doesn't thunder. It slips in, quiet, small, human, and it changes everything. In the hills above Thermopylae, where the rocks twist like broken fingers and pine trees claw at the sky, a figure moved through the shadows. Not a soldier, not a scout, a man with a crooked back and heavier dreams. Ephialtes, a name the world would remember, not in songs of glory, but in whispers of regret. He had come to the Greek camp days earlier, wearing worn clothes, carrying only a staff, and a story of Spartan blood. "I am one of you," he said. "My father fought beside your king. I want to fight." But his body, twisted by nature, bent by time, betrayed his hope before he ever raised a shield. Leonidas looked into his eyes and said it softly, "We do not reject you as a man, but we cannot accept you as a warrior." And that broke something. Because Ephialtes didn't want a spear. He wanted meaning. Not a place in the back, not pity. He wanted to stand in the front to feel the weight of duty and pride. And instead he was turned away. So he turned again, this time toward the east. He knew something. Something most didn't. A path. A narrow, winding trail through the hills. Used by shepherds, unknown to armies. It curved behind the Spartan line, above the cliffs and springs. It was the key to everything, and Ephialtes held it. He did not walk to the Persians as a coward, not in his own mind. He walked with purpose. He walked with revenge stitched into his heartbeat. Xerxes received him like a prize, not with open arms, but open ears. Ephialtes told him what no scout had found, told him of the path, the length, the bends, the time it would take. A promise. "Send your immortals through the pass, and the Greeks will be crushed." And so the Persians moved. At night, under the cloak of mist, 10,000 marched like smoke over stone. The path was narrow, the footing slick with moss and silence. But Ephialtes led them, his torch trembling, his steps firm, and behind him, the immortals, no longer bleeding, now hunting. Back in the past, the Greeks slept in pieces, some by the wall, some by the fires. Leonidas sat alone, sharpening a blade, not because it was dull, but because sleep had abandoned him long ago. He looked to the stars, and somewhere deep in the silence, he felt the balance shift. He did not know why, but something was moving. In the early hours before light broke, a runner arrived, a scout from the hills. Panting, pale, he bowed low and spoke fast. "They are coming from behind." It was not disbelief that filled the Greek camp. It was confirmation. They had always known this was a delaying battle. Always known they might be betrayed, but knowing does not soften the blow. Leonidas stood, and for a moment, the world paused with him. He gathered his men, not all, just the core. The Spartans, the Thespians who had chosen to stay, a handful of others who would rather die than kneel. He did not beg. He did not command. He asked, "Who will stand with me now that we know we fall?" And one by one they stepped forward. Not for Sparta, not even for Greece, but for honor. Behind the walls, others were told to leave, to carry word to the cities, to prepare defenses. The Thebans hesitated. The Arcadians fled. But the line remained, smaller now, tighter, sharpened. And high above, on the secret path, Ephialtes watched. He did not smile. He thought he would. He thought betrayal would taste like victory. But it tasted like ash. Below him the Greeks stood straighter than ever, and for the first time, he felt the weight of the thing he'd done. Leonidas didn't curse him, didn't even mention his name. The real betrayal wasn't a person. It was the moment, the quiet gap between two choices, where one soul shifts history for everyone else. As dawn began to burn across the peaks, the immortals crested the ridge behind the pass. The trap was set. The vice was closing. And still, the Spartans prepared. They polished their armor, fastened their cloaks, spoke to each other with the calmness of fishermen before a storm. Leonidas moved among them, touching shoulders, whispering names. He did not speak of gods. He did not promise survival. He said, "This is the day we earn the songs." In the final hours, the pass filled with an eerie glow. Two fronts now, Persians ahead, immortals behind, and in between, 300 men who had already made peace with death. A Theban tried to run. Leonidas let him. It was not punishment that kept men in place. It was choice. History often remembers betrayal as a loud, dramatic thing, but sometimes it comes with no drumbeat. Just a whisper in the dark. A step on a hidden path. A face turning the wrong way. And yet that single turn can bring empires to their knees. Ephialtes was promised gold, a reward, status, favor in the king's court, but history paid him differently. His name would not be carved on marble. No statues, no honor, just whispers, just shame. He had not defeated the Spartans. He had only shown where the rocks were soft. Below, the Spartans drew their line again, narrower now, tighter, but still unbroken. Leonidas lifted his spear. And though the Persians outnumbered them 100-1, it was the Greeks who looked like giants. A betrayal had opened the door, but it had not closed the hearts of those who chose to stand. And that would echo louder than the traitor's name. Ephialtes disappeared from the story soon after, faded into footnotes, wandered through villages in disguise, avoided eyes in every market. He had wanted a place in legend. And he got one, but not the kind sung by poets. There's a lesson here whispered between the lines, that greatness isn't just built in glory. It's forged in moments where doing the right thing hurts the most, and that betrayal, no matter how quiet, always leaves a louder echo than it intends. In the hills the path still winds. Tourists walk it now, snapping photos, tracing the route of infamy. They see the view Ephialtes saw, the cliffs, the sea, the narrow veins of stone, and they ask, how could one man change so much? But the answer is simple. He wanted to matter. And for a few moments, he did. But the Spartans? They still matter. Not because they won, but because they stayed. And in the end, between betrayal and loyalty, between shadow and sun, the world remembers the ones who stood, even when they had every reason to leave. It begins in the stillness before light, That hush when the sky is no longer black but not yet blue. The kind of silence that only happens once before something ends. The Greeks knew. They had heard the footsteps in the hills, felt the shift in the air. This would be their last day, but there was no panic, no cries, no scrambling for weapons. Just men, tightening straps, fixing broken helmets, sharpening blades already chipped from 2 days of war. There was dignity in it. Leonidas stood tall as the first color kissed the cliffs, not as a king, but as a man among equals. He called them together, not to command, but to offer choice. The pass has been breached, he said. Go, tell the others, warn the cities, this fight is no longer survival, it is memory. And so many left, not cowards, messengers. Living proof that the pass had been held, that Spartans had stood, that Xerxes had bled, but not all went. Some stayed. The Thespians, poor, outnumbered, forgotten by most Greek cities. They stayed. A few Thebans, hesitant, shifting, remained, some loyal, some afraid to flee. And the Spartans? They didn't move. They never intended to. These were not men chasing victory. They were men guarding the idea of what should be. The Persian horns called out like thunder on dry earth. Xerxes had waited for the trap to close, waited for the rear to be taken, the escape to vanish, and now he unleashed everything. Wave after wave came. Archers, spearmen, cavalry pressed into the pass like floodwater. But the Greeks did not retreat. They couldn't. There was no more room to step back. Only forward, only inward, into the fight. Spears shattered, not once, not twice, over and over again. The first wave cracked them. The second broke the shafts in half. By the third they were holding daggers, swords, then fists, stones, teeth. Their arms bled from broken shields. Their legs burned from standing too long. Their hands, cut open, torn, refused to stop gripping. Every strike came with breath. Every breath came with fire. This was not battle. It was defiance in motion. The pass, so narrow and steep, became a furnace of bodies. So many Persians died, their corpses clogged the front line. The Greeks began to climb the dead just to reach the next enemy. And through it all, Leonidas remained. A red cloak, dark with blood. A helmet dented, eyes alive. He didn't shout orders. He fought beside them, sword in one hand, shield in the other, leading not with words but with presence. He was struck, again and again, but he stood. When his blade dulled, he took another from the ground. When his shield cracked, he kept pushing forward with his shoulder. He was not trying to win. He was trying to be there, to hold the line, to show them how a king dies. And his men followed, not out of fear, out of love. The Thespians, barefoot, under-armored, fought like lions. They'd had every reason to flee. They never did. Their city would be destroyed days later for their loyalty. But they chose this. The Spartans fought with silence. There was no need for words. Only the rhythm of breath and blood. Only the sound of metal on bone. As the sun climbed higher, the walls of the pass glowed red, not from fire, but from memory. Every inch of dirt had been bought, paid in names, sweat, sacrifice. They weren't holding geography anymore. They were holding the idea that Greece was worth dying for. Then came the final wave. The immortals. Xerxes' elite, his pride, his precision. They flooded in from both ends, surrounding what was left. But the Greeks didn't collapse. They compressed, back to back, shoulder to shoulder, a circle of defiance, ringed by the dead. The king was in the center, his hair matted, his eyes wild. He was dying, not from one wound, but from all of them. Still he stood, raised his sword, blunt and bloodied, and roared into the void, a sound not meant for ears, but for the gods, for history. That roar cut through the arrows, the charge, the screams. It was the voice of a king saying, "I am still here." He fell minutes later, not on his knees, on his feet, sword buried in a Persian throat, shield still lifted. When they dragged his body down, it took more than a dozen to pry the weapon from his fingers. The Spartans closed in around him, not to escape, but to protect the fallen. Even in death, they guarded their king. Even in the last breath, they denied defeat. The Persians kept coming. They had numbers. But the Greeks had already won something the enemy never would: immortality. Not the kind carved into coins or parades, but the kind whispered from one generation to the next. The last Greek fell before noon. A thespian with no armor, blood running from his eyes. He fell with a laugh on his lips. Because he'd made it. To the end. And then there was stillness. No cheering. No triumph. Just bodies. Hundreds. Thousands. The pass was quiet again. Not because peace had returned, but because there was no one left to scream. Xerxes walked the field that afternoon. He stepped over Spartans, over his own men, over the bones of a resistance that had refused to bend. He looked at Leonidas's body, ordered it displayed, mutilated, a final insult. But even then, he couldn't erase the memory. The Spartans became more powerful in death than they had ever been in life. They became a story, a warning, a legend. Back in Sparta, the mothers wept. But they also nodded. They had told their sons, "Come back with your shield, or on it." And now they did. Back in Athens, the leaders saw the truth. The Persians had won a pass, but they had lost the fear. Greece had seen what resistance looked like, and now they would rise. Years later, when the Persians were finally turned away, when Salamis and Plataea had burned the last flags of Xerxes' dreams, it was Thermopylae they still spoke of. The place where 300 and their allies stood between a tyrant and the free world. There's a monument there now. Simple. Stone. It doesn't list names, just words. Go tell the Spartans, stranger passing by, that here, obedient to their laws we lie. Not kings, not gods, just men who stayed. And that is the final echo of the final stand. That what matters most isn't the size of the army, or the outcome of the battle. It's who you are when you know the end is coming. It's the hand that still grips the sword, the eye that still finds the enemy, the voice that still says, "We do not kneel." Leonidas died, but his defiance did not. And somewhere in every free soul, that roar still lives. It began with silence, the kind that follows a storm. Heavy, still, and watching. The Persian kings stood in the narrow pass, where thousands had died for inches of rock and dust. Smoke still clung to the cliffs. The scent of iron and ash hung in the air. Xerxes had his victory, but it didn't feel like one. He had passed through Thermopylae, but he had not broken Greece, not yet. What he had broken was the illusion of an easy war. The pass was open. The road to Athens lay before him. And so the great king marched. Behind him a tide of soldiers that could swallow the land whole. Archers from the east, cavalry from the steppes, spearmen from 100 provinces who didn't even speak the same tongue. A continent on the move. In their path were farms, villages, temples older than stories. And as they passed, they burned. It was not always strategy. Sometimes it was rage. The rage of a god-king embarrassed, humiliated by a handful of farmers, fishermen, and shepherds. So he made a statement. Fire would speak where his pride could not. The temples went first. Sacred places, pillars kissed by centuries, statues worn by prayer lit up like funeral pyres. The gods themselves, it seemed, were set ablaze. Villages were next. Empty or not, it didn't matter. Some had fled at the first whispers of war. Others had stayed, praying the storm would pass them by. None were spared. And yet, even as the fire spread, a strange thing happened. The Greeks did not fold. They grieved. They cursed. But they did not yield. Every ruin became a vow. Every burned home a promise. And somewhere across the waves, Themistocles was waiting. A man unlike Leonidas. Not a warrior king, but a builder of ships. A mind sharp with strategy. Hands scarred by politics. Athens had doubted him. Mocked him. But now they needed him. Because while Xerxes marched across the land, Themistocles prepared the sea. He gathered triremes, sleek, deadly things, not to chase glory, but to delay doom. He didn't need to defeat Persia. He needed to outthink it. And for that, he waited. But back on land, the cost was rising. Athens, golden, proud, and loud, was emptied. Its people fled to the island of Salamis, its stones left behind to face fire alone. Xerxes arrived not to find resistance, but wind blowing through empty streets. Still he burned it. The Parthenon, the temples, the homes. He claimed it as a prize, but it was a ghost, and ghosts don't bleed. In those ashes, something shifted. The Greeks, watching from across the straits, saw their capital fall. And instead of breaking, they hardened. Themistocles saw it in their eyes. He didn't need to inspire them. The Persians had done that for him. He sent word to the other city-states. Sparta, Corinth, Aegina. Some came with pride, others with fear. But all came knowing this. Thermopylae had bought them time. Now it was their turn to spend it. Themistocles devised a trap. Salamis, narrow, choked with islands and straits, was no place for a massive fleet. But it was perfect for a small, fast one. And Xerxes, proud, impatient, took the bait. But before we leap into the waves and the battle to come, we must linger just a little longer in the price paid to reach this moment. Because the cost wasn't just measured in bodies. It was memory. The people of Greece, especially the Athenians, had seen what it meant to lose, to flee, to watch sacred hills consumed in flame. That kind of loss doesn't vanish. It echoes. It shapes the way a people see themselves and what they'll fight for. At Thermopylae, they learned what courage looked like. At Athens, they learned what grief tasted like. And from both, they forged resolve. History often remembers victories, names carved into stone, dates taught to children. But sometimes it's the defeats that matter more, because defeats leave scars, and scars are reminders you were there, that you stood, that you fought, that you paid the price. Thermopylae was a wound. Athens in flames was another. But together they formed a question. What do we do now? And for the first time, city-states that had once feuded began to whisper the same answer. Unite. Strike. Resist. They hadn't yet won a war, but they had chosen to stay in it. And sometimes, that is the beginning of everything. In the shadows of burning temples, priests recited prayers to ruins. Children watched fires that once warmed their homes. Now they watched those fires devour them. But still, there was no surrender. Mothers carried what they could. Fathers guided flocks across mountains. Elders remembered older invasions and muttered curses into the wind. The Persians thought conquest would silence a people. But it only gave them a story. And stories are hard to kill. So when Themistocles stood before the captains of Greece, his hands gesturing across maps and coastlines, he wasn't just drawing up naval tactics. He was channeling all that loss, all that memory, All that fury. He knew that what was coming at Salamis would not just be ships on water. It would be the answer, the response to Thermopylae, the echo to a king's last roar, the return message to fire and death. It wouldn't erase what was lost. Leonidas was still dead, Athens still burned. But maybe, just maybe, it could prove something. That Greece was not a scattered archipelago of arguments and pride, but a people. That courage was not confined to one mountain pass. It flowed from land to sea to soul. Back in Persia, they would write of the victory at Thermopylae, of the brave resistance, of the god-king's unstoppable progress. But in Greece, they would remember it differently, not as the moment they were broken, but the moment they began to unite. Because some defeats aren't endings, they're seeds. And when planted deep enough, and watered with blood, and bathed in fire, they bloom into something unstoppable. Themistocles knew this. He didn't mourn Thermopylae. He sharpened it, used it, turned it into a dagger aimed at the empire's heart. And across the blue waters of the Aegean, the wind shifted. War was coming again. But this time, the Greeks weren't scattered. They were waiting. Xerxes would soon hear the reply. In the clashing of oars, in the thunder of rams, in the shouts of men who had nothing left to lose because they had already lost everything. But that is a story for another shore. For now, let us linger one last moment at the line between despair and resolve. Between what is burned and what will rise. The price of memory is high, but what it buys is the future. How myth reshaped the truth. There are events, and then there are echoes. One happens in a moment. The other lives forever. Thermopylae was a battle, but what it became was a story, not just written in ink, but in breath, in sculpture, in silence. A narrow pass, a few thousand men, 300 Spartans, a defeat, and yet we remember it like a hymn. Why? Because history tells us what happened, but song tells us why it mattered. And in the space between the two, between what was real and what we need to be real, myth blooms. His name was Herodotus, a man of scrolls and sandals. He wandered cities and coastlines, collecting whispers, the way others collect coins. They called him the father of history. But perhaps he was also the first great storyteller of war. He was not there at Thermopylae, but he gave it voice. He did not see Leonidas fall, but he gave him immortality. Herodotus did not just write what happened, he shaped it. He took facts, messy, half-known, distorted by distance, and bound them with reverence. He painted the Spartans in strokes of bronze and fire. He gave speeches to the dead. He made the mountains echo with purpose. He told us, they were outnumbered, but they stood. They were betrayed, but they fought. They died, but they chose to die. And maybe all of that is true. Or maybe it's almost true. True enough to believe. True enough to carry. The Spartans became more than men. They became a symbol of duty, of endurance, of choosing death over dishonor. And once a people become a symbol, you stop asking what they ate, or if they were afraid, or if they argued among themselves in the cold night. You remember only what you need to remember. A shield wall that didn't break. A king who knelt to no one. A final charge into certain death. It didn't matter that other Greeks fought too. Thespians, Thebans, forgotten in the shadow of Sparta's song. It didn't matter that some things were messier, uglier, more human. What mattered was the shape of the story. Because stories are how we survive the past. We cannot carry every detail, but we can carry a flame. And Thermopylae burned bright, so we sculpted it, In marble, in paintings, in the steel rhythms of war drums centuries later, Leonidas became a statue, jaw locked in defiance. The 300 became a legend. Do we know their names? A few. Do we know their faces? Only what imagination gives us. But we know their purpose, because Herodotus gave it to us. Was he wrong? Maybe. But sometimes wrong in the right way. He understood that memory isn't just facts, it's feeling. That some truths are emotional, not literal. That what we believe can outlast what we know. The 300 were not immortal. They died in blood and silence. But the idea of them, the courage, the discipline, the fire in their eyes that lives in every retelling. And over time, the idea became larger than the men. Poets added their verses. Generals referenced their sacrifice. Nations born long after would look back and say, that's who we want to be. Even when the world changed, when swords gave way to rifles, when empires rose and fell, Thermopylae remained. Frozen in time, stubborn in memory. But why? Why this battle, this loss? Why not the thousands of victories forgotten? The other moments of valor buried by dust? Because Thermopylae gave us something rare. It gave us clarity. A single road. A simple choice. Stand or fall. No grand politics. No moral ambiguity. Just men standing where they had no reason to, except that it was right. And so it fit perfectly into song. Songs crave clarity. They crave sacrifice. They crave beauty inside pain. And Thermopylae gave it all. The details faded. The message remained. Even in the centuries after Herodotus, writers reached back to Thermopylae, as if it held the answer to something modern life could not explain. Why do we fight? Why do we resist? What makes death noble? And each time the 300 were summoned, not as history, but as memory shaped into meaning. Artists chiseled their poses. Politicians quoted their final stand. Films lit their capes with golden fire. But this is where the line blurs. Because when we repeat a story often enough, we don't just remember it, we recreate it. And Thermopylae was recreated again and again into whatever each generation needed. For some, it was a tale of Western freedom against Eastern tyranny. For others, a lesson in masculine duty. Sometimes a tragedy. Sometimes a rallying cry. But always, it was usable. That's the strange thing about myth. It doesn't just survive time. It adapts to it. So what do we do with that? Do we dismiss the legend? Dig beneath it to find the bones of truth? Do we strip away the poetry until only dry facts remain? Or do we let the song continue, knowing it's imperfect, but still worth singing? There is no easy answer. But perhaps the point is not to choose between history and song. Perhaps the truth lies between them, because we are not machines. We are not led by data alone. We are led by meaning, by story, by feeling. When Herodotus described Thermopylae, he was not just recording a war. He was building a monument in words, one that could not burn, one that could not be conquered. And we're still walking its halls, still touching the cold stone of sacrifice, still whispering, "Go tell the Spartans." Do we remember what truly happened? No, but we remember what it meant. And sometimes, that is the deeper truth. Leonidas and his men are gone, their bones long scattered, but their echoes remain. Not because they won, but because they were seen. Seen by poets, seen by children, seen by generations who saw in them a reflection of what courage might look like when everything else is lost. It is tempting to say, let's strip away the myth. But myths are not just lies. They are wishes. They are memory, softened by love. They are grief, retold until it becomes bearable. And so we honor both, the battle as it was, and the battle as we remember it. Between the two, we find ourselves. Because each time we tell the story, we are also asking a question. Would I have stood? Would I have stayed knowing I would die? Would I have held the line? And maybe we hope deep down that if that day ever comes, we will remember this story and find our answer. In the end, the Spartans were men, flawed, mortal, brief. But in the hands of storytellers, they became something else, a lesson, a mirror, a song. And that song, it still plays, softly, beneath the noise of modern life, a distant echo, calling us back to a narrow pass, where men died not for victory, but for each other. That's the price of memory, and the gift of myth. In the next chapter, we sail to Salamis, where oars strike water like drumbeats, where strategy dances with chaos, and where Themistocles answers Xerxes not with words, but with the sea. The wind still speaks here. At Thermopylae, where mountains cradle the sea like old lovers, the silence is thick, not empty, but full. Full of footsteps long gone, full of words once whispered, now carried by the breeze. Today the pass is wider. The coastline has shifted. What was once a narrow throat of land choked by cliff and tide is now more open, more forgiving. The world moved on. But the ground remembers. You can drive past it now without knowing. You can blink and miss it. Or you can stop, step out and feel it. Not just the heat from the sun or the buzz of insects in the brush, but something older, deeper, quieter, the kind of silence that hums. A monument stands near the spot where the wall once rose and the Spartans once braced. It bears only a line, a single echo of a promise. Go tell the Spartans, stranger passing by, that here, obedient to their laws, we lie. The words are not loud. They don't shout. They whisper. And in that whisper, the mountain exhales. Tourists come, of course. They bring cameras, water bottles, and curiosity. Some read plaques. Some pose for pictures. But a few just stand there. They don't say anything. They just listen. Because here, in this forgotten corridor between myth and memory, you don't need to speak. The stones do it for you. At night, when the road quiets and the last bus leaves, the place feels older. The heat lingers like a ghost, and the air becomes heavy with yesterday. There is no music, only cicadas and the occasional rustle of dry grass. But if you close your eyes, you might hear boots in the dirt. A soft command, the clang of iron slipping into place. You might hear breath, not yours. Someone bracing for the end. Not out of fear, but because they chose to. Thermopylae is not a grave. It's a story still being told. Some say the Spartans died here for freedom. Some say they died for law. Some say they died because pride left them no other way. But maybe they died, so we would never forget that people can still choose meaning, even in the face of meaninglessness. That there's a kind of peace found in choosing your own end. A kind of immortality that doesn't need marble or song, just memory. In nearby towns, the children learn the names. Leonidas, Dionysus, Alpheus, Demophilus. Names not taught for grades, but for something more important. For the idea that courage isn't about winning. It's about showing up, even when you know you can't. Some nights the stars feel closer here, as if even the heavens lean down to look. And maybe that's why centuries later the world still turns its eyes to this place. Not because of its strategic value, not because of its ruins, but because somewhere between mountain and sea, between arrow and shield, between silence and scream, humanity left behind a message. Even when you lose, you matter. Thermopylae is not a tragedy. It's a lullaby made of fire and blood and unshakable purpose, sung softly to those who lie awake, wondering if their choices will ever matter. It tells you, you don't have to win. You just have to stand. And in the standing, you change everything. The story was retold by poets, reshaped by generals, sculpted by artists, rewritten by filmmakers. Sometimes truth was left behind, but the soul remained. Because even when facts fade, feeling doesn't. And this story? It wasn't meant to be dissected. It was meant to be remembered. Here, the earth no longer shakes, but the spirit still does. Children walk the trails where Spartans fell. Elders nod at the monument quietly. Flags flutter above the path, not as triumph, but as thanks. You can almost imagine a helmet lying in the grass, a spear resting beside a stone, not as relics, but as reminders. Across the world, the number 300 inches became something else. Not just a count, not just a legend, but a symbol of resolve, of resistance, of remembering what matters when everything else has been stripped away. Sleep now, traveler. You've walked the mountain pass. You've stood in the dust where heroes bled. You've heard their silence. Let it settle into you. Let it remind you that even in your smallest moments, you carry the echo of giants. Close your eyes. Let the hills hold your dreams. Let the sea carry your thoughts out with the tide. And know this: somewhere in the night, the 300 still stand, not in defiance, not in fear, but in quiet welcome, watching over those who remember